Welcome to the Power in Excellence podcast.
This is The Unseen Advantage, part of the Power in Excellence podcast series.
Hello and welcome. This is indeed the Power in Excellence podcast, and welcome to this episode 6 of our special series, The Unseen Advantage, in which we're exploring the secret psychology of leadership. And today we're talking about acceptance versus control, the power that you're wasting without even realizing it. And today I'd like to invite you to join me in a moment. Not a dramatic moment, there are no raised voices, there's no obvious tension, nothing that you could even point to in a post-meeting summary and say, yeah, that's where it all went wrong. Just something that didn't move. Imagine, if you will, a call has just ended, the screen goes dark, and Sarah, the CEO, composed, highly capable, somebody who's spent her entire career being effective in getting things done, and she's just sitting there, completely still, looking at the screen. Now, if you walked in at that moment, you wouldn't see anything unusual at all. You wouldn't see the frustration, there's no visible reaction. But something just happened. And Sarah is doing what we all do at some point or another. She's replaying it over and over in her head. Not the entire conversation, just fragments, just bits of it, just the bits that she thinks are important. That slight hesitation from the client, the shift in tone halfway through the conversation, the moment where the energy dipped and, unfortunately, never quite recovered. And if you've ever been in that situation, you'll recognize what comes next. Sarah reaches for meaning, because the brain doesn't tolerate ambiguity particularly well. And so what we do instead is we fill in the gap. And after a few minutes, Sarah lands on a brilliant conclusion. I just need to be clearer next time. Now, that sounds right. It sounds intelligent. It sounds rational. And it even sounds professional. It sounds like somebody taking responsibility. And in organizations, or at least most organizations, it would be rewarded as exactly that. But underneath it, there's an assumption. A very quiet assumption. The assumption that this was mine to control. And that assumption right there, more than anything else that was said on that call, determines what Sarah does next. I'll be right back.
Great leaders aren't born, they're built. The Power in Excellence podcast with Dr. John reveals the psychology behind influence, confidence, high performance, and human behaviour. No fluff, just powerful insights you can use immediately to lead better, think clearer, and perform at a higher level. Follow now and level up.
Let's introduce something here. One of the core philosophies that sits at the very center of everything that we do here at Power and Excellence is this. The world that you experience is the world that you perceive. Not the world as it is, but the world as you interpret it. Now that sounds philosophical, but in practice it's brutally concrete. Because Sarah isn't responding to what actually happened on that call. She's responding to her interpretation of it. And her interpretation is, the issue was clarity. But here's the problem. If that interpretation is wrong, everything that follows will also be wrong. Because now she's trying to solve the wrong problem. And solving the wrong problem, however effectively, is one of the fastest ways to create poor outcomes. And here's another principle that matters here. The response reflects the meaning of the communication. In other words, if the deal didn't move, that tells you something, not about what you intended, but about what was received. And this is where most people go wrong. They evaluate their communication based on intention. I explained it clearly, I made a strong case, I presented it very logically. But the only thing that matters is how the other person responds. And the response in this case was no movement. And that means something in the communication, or the interpretation of it, didn't land. But instead of exploring that, Sarah moves to control. And control is so tempting. But let's be fair to her. Control doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like competence. It feels like leadership. Because when something doesn't go to plan, our brain doesn't just observe it, it reacts. There's a slight tightening, a subtle internal shift, a sense that something is off. And beneath that is uncertainty. And here's what most people don't realize. Uncertainty isn't processed as neutral. It's processed as a form of threat, not because it is dangerous, but because it might be dangerous. And the brain doesn't particularly enjoy might be. Research shows that uncertainty often produces stronger stress responses than known negative outcomes. And that's slightly ridiculous when you think about it, because what it really means is that your brain would rather know that something bad is happening than not know at all. So it tries to resolve that uncertainty, and it does it in one of two ways. It either updates its understanding of reality, and it just accepts it, or it tries to change the reality itself and tries to control it. And unfortunately, control is faster and feels easier. So most of the time, control wins. So let's go back to Sarah, because Sarah could have done something different in this situation. She could have stepped into what we call the loop of excellence, not as a tool, but as a way of thinking. The loop of excellence asks a very different question. Instead of asking, what do I need to do differently? It asks, what actually happened? Not what do you think happened, or what do you assume happened, or even what do you wish happened? What actually happened? And then it asks, what did I do that contributed to that outcome? Then what was missing? And finally, it asks, what would I do differently if I were to run this again? Now, notice the difference here, because control jumps straight to action. The loop of excellence forces you through understanding, and understanding is where accuracy lives. But let's deepen the psychology a wee bit, because this isn't just a behavioural quirk. In the 1970s, psychologist Ellen Langer introduced the concept of the illusion of control. In one of her most famous studies, Langer took two groups of people and gave each of them a lottery ticket. Now, the first group got a randomly picked lottery ticket, but the second group were allowed to pick their own. And something really interesting happened here. The participants who chose their own ticket valued it more, assigned higher worth to it, and believed that it increased their chances of winning, even though the probability hadn't changed at all. Later on, when participants were asked if they wanted to sell their ticket, the group who had chosen their own ticket were far more reluctant to sell it, and when they eventually did, they demanded a higher sum for it. Now, we might say here that this is because people overvalue their choices, but that's not quite accurate either, because what's happening here is even deeper. Choice creates ownership, and ownership creates a sense of agency, and that agency is misinterpreted as control. In other words, the people who had chosen their own lottery tickets believed that they controlled, to an extent, the outcome. Another of Langer's experiments involved participants throwing dice with a view to getting higher or lower numbers. And what happened here was also interesting. When participants were aiming for higher numbers, they threw the dice harder. And they were aiming for lower numbers, they threw softer, which is objectively absurd. But subjectively, it felt right. It felt correct. Because the action created a sense of involvement, and involvement creates perceived influence. So this is where it becomes relevant to leadership. When environments contain cues associated with skill, people assume control. So if something looks like decision-making, strategy, or performance, people treat it as controllable, even when it isn't. Modern organizations are full of these cues, and that means the illusion is constantly reinforced. And here's where it gets just a wee bit uncomfortable. The more experienced you are, the more vulnerable you are, not less. Because experience builds patterns, and patterns build confidence. And confidence quietly becomes, I understand how this works. And that's true until it doesn't, until the system becomes complex. And then effort is no longer the primary driver, but your brain keeps treating it as if it is. So when things don't work, we don't question the system, we increase our effort. And that's where control escalates. So what happens when we introduce victim virus? Most people misunderstand this. They think it's about blame. It's not. Victim virus is about where you locate control. There are two subtle positions here. One is, this didn't work because of them, and the other is, this didn't work because I didn't control it well enough. Both of these are distortions. Both remove accuracy. One removes ownership, and the other creates false ownership. And false ownership is just as dangerous, because now you're taking responsibility for variables that you don't control, and that leads to over-control. and that leads to poor outcomes. Let's go somewhere where this is absolutely impossible to ignore. A casino. There's a person sitting at a slot machine. You've probably seen them. You may even have been one. Now, that person sitting at the slot machine, they know it's random, and yet they behave as if it isn't. They press the buttons deliberately. They develop patterns. They even create rituals. They lean forward. They lean backward. They act as if their behavior somehow influences the outcome. And in a way it does, really. Not externally, but internally. Because something really intriguing happens when you get two symbols that align and the third one just misses. The player loses. But their brain doesn't process it as a full loss. It activates reward pathways, and that creates a very specific experience because it doesn't feel like failure, it feels like progress. It feels like, I'm getting closer. Even though nothing has changed, even though they still lost. And this is where things can get a wee bit dangerous because now effort is driven by perception, not reality. Let's go back to Sarah and that call. Sarah didn't lose the deal because she lacked clarity. She lost it because she misinterpreted the situation, and instead of correcting the interpretation, she moved to control the outcome. And that's exactly what the gambler does. Different context, but exactly the same psychology.
You're listening to the Power and Excellence podcast with Dr. John.
So by now, something fairly uncomfortable should be quite apparent to us. Control doesn't just fail occasionally. It fails in a very particular way. It fails quietly. It fails while it still looks and feels like effort, still looks, feels, and sounds like leadership. It still feels internally as if we're doing the right thing. And that's precisely why we stay in it, because nothing about it looks or feels like a mistake. And if it doesn't look or feel like a mistake, we don't question it. Imagine Sarah a week or so later, in a different room, slightly different conversation, same underlying pattern. She's sitting there with her leadership team, and on the surface, everything is going tickety-boo, hunky-dory, perfect. People are speaking, updates are being given, metrics are being reviewed. But if we pay attention, something is missing. There's a lack of energy, not dramatic energy, just things are just slightly muted. People are contributing, but maybe a wee bit cautiously. People are responding, but they're not driving. They're present, but not fully engaged. And then there's David. He's capable, he's experienced, and he's also slightly underperforming. Not in a massive way that's going to cause him to lose his job, but just in a way that creates ambiguity, in a way that's noticeable enough for Sarah to want to have a conversation. And psychologically, that's far more difficult to deal with because ambiguity doesn't trigger action, it triggers interpretation. And interpretation is where things start to go wrong. And again, there's that moment where expectation meets reality. And the brain moves. You can almost see it happening. The urge to tighten, the urge to intervene, to apply structure. And in most organizations, that looks like, okay, let's clarify expectations. Let's increase visibility. Let's track this a little bit more closely. All of these are perfectly reasonable, but subtly wrong. Here's something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Control becomes more likely in groups because now it's not just your internal discomfort. It's social pressure. You're being watched. You're being evaluated. We're being expected to respond. And uncertainty in group settings, that feels dangerous because it risks perception. So most leaders do the same thing. They move quickly. They say something. They act. They create the appearance of certainty, even when they don't have it, which in many ways is the beginning of the problem. But here, something different happens. Sarah doesn't move quickly. She doesn't move immediately because she notices the impulse, that tightening, the urge to step in, the urge to fix, the urge to regain control. And this is the critical moment both for her and for David. So instead of acting, Sarah pauses. It's not a long, dramatic pause with a big sigh or anything like that. Nobody leans back and applauds. It's just subtle. But it creates something that wasn't there before. It creates space. And in that space, Sarah does something different. She moves from control to curiosity. And she asks David, How are you seeing this at the moment? Now, that question, as short as it is incredibly powerful and very effective. Because it doesn't just gather information, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation. It shifts the focus from what's wrong with your performance to what's happening in your perception. And this is where the power and excellence model becomes critical. Because if the world that you experience is the world that you perceive, then performance isn't just about behavior, it's about interpretation. And if you don't understand the interpretation, you will always misdiagnose behavior. And this is where it gets really interesting, because David also pauses. Not defensively, there's no resistance, he's just thinking. And that's already a shift, because he's not defensive. And then he says something that reframes the entire situation. He says,
I'm not entirely sure what success looks like here anymore.
And just like that, the entire problem has changed. Because now it's not he's underperforming, it's he's unclear. And those are fundamentally different problems. One invites control, and the other invites alignment. And this is where the loop of excellence also becomes more than just a concept. It becomes a behavior. Instead of jumping into correction, Sarah moves through the loop. She asks, what happened? Not the assumption, not the interpretation, the reality. Then she asks, what did I do to contribute to that? Not in a self-critical way, but in an accurate way, in an objective way. And then she asks, what was missing? Not what went wrong, because that's a very different question. She asks what wasn't there, what wasn't present in the situation. And finally she asks, what would we do differently if we were to rerun the situation? Now, notice something here. The process doesn't increase control at any point. It increases clarity, and clarity is what enables effective action. So let's go back to something that we touched on earlier on, the victim virus. Now, in most discussions, it gets framed as blaming others, but in high performers, it shows up slightly differently. It shows up as over-ownership. It shows up as, this didn't work because I didn't control it well enough, which sounds admirable. It sounds like a really strong leader, and it's completely inaccurate. Because now you're taking responsibility for variables that we don't actually control. And that leads to overcorrection, and that leads to overcontrol, and that leads to even poorer outcomes. So the real distinction isn't ownership versus blame, it's accurate ownership versus distorted ownership. And the distorted ownership is just as limiting. So let's zoom out a bit and take this dynamic and apply it across an entire organization. The organization notices that performance is dipping slightly here and there. Not enough that the financial journals are writing about it, but enough that leadership responds. And they respond with control, more reporting, more structure, more oversight. And initially it works. Of course it works, because pressure produces compliance and deadlines get hit, outputs improve, everything looks tighter, everything looks fantastic, and leadership pat themselves on the back saying, well done, we did it. But underneath, something begins to erode. Initiative disappears. People stop thinking independently. Decision-making begins to slow down because every decision now carries even more scrutiny, more oversight, more consequence, and eventually performance just plateaus. Not because people are incapable, but because the system has removed conditions for performance. And this is hard to see, and this is the real problem, because it doesn't look like failure. It looks like stability. And stability, to a certain extent, can be really dangerous because nobody questions it. It just becomes normal. And over time, the organization becomes more controlled, less effective, and completely unaware of the connection between the two.
This is The Unseen Advantage, part of the Power and Excellence podcast series.
Let's go back and visit Sarah and see how she's doing. It's her quarterly review with the board, and the numbers are ever so slightly down. Not so much that the financial journals are writing about it, but enough that there are some murmured conversations in the boardroom. And the questions begin. What's driving this? What's the plan? How do we fix it? Now, this is where most leaders revert completely to control because the stakes here are way higher and visibility is greater. And uncertainty in this context feels really dangerous. So most leaders over-explain, over-commit, overcorrect, and they try to remove uncertainty immediately, which, of course, is impossible. So this time, Sarah does something different. She doesn't rush. She doesn't try to close the gap instantly. She allows the uncertainty to exist and sit there in the room. And trust me, psychologically, that is far, far harder than it sounds. But then she responds. She responds deliberately. She says, "We're seeing early shifts in behavior. We don't yet have full clarity. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's where we're focusing." Now, that's a really smart response because it does two things. It acknowledges reality and it maintains stability. And that combination of acknowledging reality and maintaining stability, that's influence. Because influence isn't about eliminating uncertainty, it's about operating effectively within it. So let's make this absolutely clear. Control is about forcing outcomes. Influence is about shaping conditions. Control assumes if I do enough, I can make this happen. Influence understands outcomes emerge from systems. Because control is rigid. It demands compliance. Influence, on the other hand, is adaptive and creates alignment. And in complex systems, alignment always outperforms force. So if we strip this right back, we can remind ourselves that we don't control other people, we don't control outcomes, we don't control environments. The only thing we can really control are our attention, our interpretation, and our response. And that's it. And it doesn't sound like much, but these three things determine everything because interpretation drives behavior, and behavior shapes outcome. Remember our gambler pulling the lever, believing that they're getting closer? That's just like the leader who pushes harder, believing that more effort will unlock results. Different environments, exactly the same psychology. The illusion of progress.
You're listening to the Power and Excellence podcast with Dr. John.
Before we wrap up for today, let me leave you with 5 key takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, most stress doesn't come from what's happening, it comes from trying to control what isn't controllable. Number 2, the illusion of control increases with experience, and that means the more capable you are, the more aware you need to be. Number 3, almost working is often misread as progress, in business as much as in gambling. Number 4, acceptance isn't passive. It's the foundation of accurate perception and effective action. Number 5, real power is not about controlling outcomes, it's about remaining stable and effective within uncertainty. So here's the question. Where in your life or in your organization are you pulling the lever again and again because it feels like you're getting closer, when in reality, nothing fundamental has changed? Because that's the moment, that's the decision point. Do you continue the loop or do you step back and see clearly and choose differently? Next time on The Unseen Advantage, we're exploring why competence doesn't guarantee influence and what actually does. And that one tends to change how people see themselves. So until next time, this has been The Unseen Advantage. I will see you next time in the next episode or elsewhere in the Power and Excellence podcast series. Until then, look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
This boy, Dr. John, he know for sure what he talking about. Tell your friends to listen to the Power and Excellence podcast. If you haven't subscribed to the Power and Excellence podcast, what are you waiting for?